I first met Mr. Douglas one summer afternoon when he was trimming the hedges that bordered our homes. He was a tall man with silver hair and an air of quiet dignity, though his eyes carried a sadness that seemed out of place in our tranquil neighborhood. I had just moved in a few months earlier and was still adjusting to the slower pace of suburban life. As I passed by, he looked up and nodded, a faint smile creasing his face. "New to the neighborhood, huh?" he said, his voice warm but measured. "Yes," I replied, stepping closer. "I'm Evan. Just moved in a few houses down." "Paul Douglas," he said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, but there was a hesitation in his demeanor, as if he wasn't used to introducing himself anymore. From that brief exchange, I wouldn't have guessed how profoundly our lives would intertwine. It began simply enough. A few friendly conversations over the fence, occasional exchanges of tools, and polite nods when we crossed paths. But beneath the surface of our casual interactions, there was an unspoken tension, a shared loneliness that neither of us acknowledged aloud. Paul's wife, Susan, was often away. He mentioned it in passing one evening when I ran into him at the local grocery store. "She's visiting her sister again," he said, his tone neutral but edged with something unspoken. I didn't press for details, but the way he lingered in the conversation suggested he wasn't eager to return to an empty house. Over time, I noticed how Susan's absences seemed to weigh on him. He'd sit on his porch in the evenings, nursing a drink and staring into the distance. I began to join him, drawn by an inexplicable need to keep him company. At first, our conversations were light, chats about the weather, his garden, or the books he liked to read. But as the weeks passed, they grew deeper. "I wasn't always like this, you know," Paul confided one night, his voice low and reflective. "I used to be more alive, I guess. Susan and I were happy once, but now—" He trailed off, staring into his glass as if it held the answers he sought. I didn't know what to say. At 29, my experiences with love and loss felt inadequate compared to the weight of his words. Still, I listened, offering what little comfort I could. One evening, Paul invited me inside. His house was neat but devoid of warmth, as though it had been arranged for appearances rather than comfort. He poured us each a drink, and we sat in his living room, the air heavy with unspoken thoughts. "Do you ever feel like you're just going through the motions?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But I guess that's part of life, isn't it? You keep moving forward, hoping things will get better." He nodded but didn't look convinced. "I envy your optimism. At my age, it feels more like endurance than hope." There was a vulnerability in his words that caught me off guard. Paul was a man of few complaints, yet here he was, bearing a piece of his soul to someone half his age. It was in that moment that I realized how deeply he yearned for connection, not just with his wife, but with anyone who could understand him. As the weeks turned into months, our bond deepened. I found myself looking forward to our conversations, drawn to his quiet strength and the complexity of his emotions. He, in turn, seemed to find solace in my company, as though my presence filled a void he couldn't quite articulate. But the closer we grew, the more I sensed an unspoken tension between us. It wasn't romantic, at least not yet, but there was an intimacy that transcended friendship. A touch lingered a moment too long. A glance held more meaning than it should. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. One evening, after helping Paul fix a loose fence board, I found myself sitting beside him on the porch again. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. "Thank you for this," he said, gesturing to the repaired fence. "And for everything, really. You've been good to me." "You don't have to thank me," I replied, feeling a warmth rise in my chest. "That's what neighbors are for." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Not every neighbor would go out of their way like you have. I've been feeling lost for a long time, and you've reminded me that there's still kindness in the world." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I wanted to say something reassuring, but the intensity of his gaze rendered me speechless. For a moment, It felt as though the world had shrunk to just the two of us, bound together by an invisible thread. "I should go," I said abruptly, breaking the spell. "It's getting late." Paul nodded, his expression unreadable. "Of course. Thank you again, Evan." As I walked back to my house, my mind raced with conflicting emotions. I told myself that I was simply being a good neighbor, that there was nothing wrong with offering support to someone in need. But in the depths of my heart, I couldn't ignore the pull I felt toward Paul, the longing to be more than just a friend. And so, our story began, two lonely souls navigating the fragile boundary between companionship and something far more dangerous. Neither of us knew where it would lead, but one thing was certain: we were no longer strangers passing by. We were connected now, in ways that neither of us could fully understand. Over the next few weeks, my visits to Paul's house became a quiet ritual. What began as casual conversations over the fence soon evolved into something more regular. A shared meal here, a borrowed book there. Paul's house, with its polished floors and perfectly arranged furniture, still felt cold, but his presence made it warmer, a refuge from the outside world. I began to notice small details about him. The way his hands lingered on a page when he read aloud, his soft laugh when I shared a funny story, and the faint scent of aftershave that lingered in the air when he moved past me. It was in these small moments that the boundary between neighborly kindness and something deeper began to blur. One rainy evening, I found myself on his doorstep with a bottle of wine. I hadn't planned to visit, but the storm outside and the silence of my own home pushed me toward his. When Paul opened the door, his surprise quickly melted into a smile. "Evan," he said, stepping aside to let me in. "I wasn't expecting company tonight." "Neither was I admitted, holding up the bottle. "But I figured a storm like this calls for a little company." We settled in his living room, the sound of rain tapping against the windows. Paul poured the wine, and we raised our glasses, the flicker of candlelight reflecting in his eyes. "To unexpected company," he said, his voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place. "To good neighbors," I replied, though the word felt inadequate for what we had become. As the night wore on, the conversation turned personal. Paul shared stories of his younger years, his ambitions, his travels, and the early days of his marriage. He spoke of Susan with a mixture of fondness and regret, his words painting a picture of a love that had once been vibrant but had now faded into something unrecognizable. "She was my everything," he said, staring into his glass. "But somewhere along the way we lost each other. Now, it's like we're just coexisting in the same space, waiting for something to change but never taking the steps to fix it." I hesitated before responding, unsure of how much to reveal. "I think everyone craves connection," I said finally. "It's hard to live without it." Paul looked at me then, his gaze piercing and vulnerable. "And you, Evan? Do you have that connection with anyone?" The question caught me off guard. I'd always been open about my life, but something about the way he asked made it feel different, more intimate. "I don't," I admitted. "Not right now. It's hard to find someone who really sees you, you know?" He nodded slowly, his expression softening. "I think I understand that better than most." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy with unspoken truths, a shared understanding that neither of us was ready to voice. When the storm finally began to subside, I stood to leave, but Paul stopped me with a hand on my arm. "Stay a little longer," he said quietly. "It's late and I'd hate for you to drive in this weather." I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest, but the look in his eyes was impossible to refuse. "Okay," I said, sitting back down. The hours stretched on, and the conversation grew softer, more intimate. At some point, our hands brushed as we reached for the wine bottle, and neither of us pulled away. The touch was electric, sending a jolt through me that I knew he must have felt too. "I don't know what's happening here," Paul said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't ignore it anymore." I swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. "Neither can I admitted. For a moment, we simply looked at each other, the air between us charged with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. Then, slowly, tentatively, he reached out and took my hand in his. "This feels wrong," he said, though his grip on my hand didn't loosen. "But at the same time, it feels like the first real thing I've felt in years." I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. "You don't have to explain, Paul. I understand." We didn't speak after that, but the silence said more than words ever could. The boundaries between us had shifted, and there was no going back. When I finally left that night, the storm had passed, but the tension between us remained, a storm of a different kind brewing beneath the surface. From that moment on, our interactions took on a new depth. There were lingering touches, stolen glances, and conversations laced with subtext. We tried to maintain the facade of normalcy, but the truth was always there, simmering just below the surface. One afternoon, as we worked together in his garden, Paul paused and turned to me. "Do you ever think about what might happen if we cross a line we can't uncross?" "Every day," I admitted. "But I also think about what might happen if we don't." His expression was unreadable, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. "It's complicated, Evan. I don't want to hurt anyone, but I can't deny what I feel." "Neither can I," said softly. For the first time in years, Paul smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Then maybe it's worth the risk," he said, his voice steady. In that moment, I knew there was no turning back. We were on the edge of something dangerous and beautiful, and neither of us had the strength to resist it. Paul and I spent the next several weeks navigating a delicate balance between secrecy and connection. Every touch, every word between us carried a weight that neither of us acknowledged aloud. Yet, despite the intensity of our growing bond, an undeniable shadow loomed over everything: Susan. She was never far from Paul's thoughts, even in her absence, and her return felt like an inevitability we couldn't avoid. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself back at Paul's home. He was seated at the dining table, a half-empty glass of whiskey in his hand. The air between us was heavy, charged with unspoken tension. "She called today," Paul said abruptly, his voice strained. "She's coming back next week?" I froze, the words hitting me like a cold wind. "What does that mean for us?" He sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I don't know. I've been asking myself the same question all day." I sat across from him, searching his face for answers. "Do you still love her?" Paul's eyes met mine, filled with a mixture of guilt and longing. "I don't know if I even know what love is anymore. What we had, it feels like a memory, something distant. But what I feel with you, it's real. It's here now." His words should have comforted me, but instead, they deepened my conflict. How could something that felt so right exist in a world where it could only bring pain? As the week went on, the tension between us grew. We spent as much time together as we could, stealing moments like thieves afraid of being caught. There was an urgency to everything we did, as if we were racing against an invisible clock. Then came the night when everything changed. Paul invited me over for dinner, insisting on cooking one of his favorite recipes. The meal was simple but heartfelt, and the atmosphere was warm despite the looming uncertainty. As we cleared the dishes, he reached out and took my hand, his touch sending a familiar shiver down my spine. "Evan," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "I need you to know how much you've meant to me. You've brought something back into my life that I thought was gone forever." I squeezed his hand, my heart aching at the vulnerability in his words. "You've meant just as much to me, Paul. But what happens now?" He didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the flickering candle between us. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I do know that I can't keep living like this, torn between two lives. It's not fair to you or to her." For a long moment, we sat in silence, the gravity of his words sinking in. Finally, he stood, pulling me to my feet. "I want to remember this night," he said softly. "No matter what happens." The hours that followed were filled with an intimacy we had never dared to share before. It was both a beginning and an ending, a moment suspended in time that neither of us wanted to let go of. But all moments must pass, and morning brought with it the harsh light of reality. The day Susan returned, I stayed away, unsure of my place in Paul's life now. My phone remained silent, and the absence of his messages felt like a weight pressing on my chest. Days turned into a week, and I began to wonder if our connection had been severed for good. Then, late one evening, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find Paul standing there, his face pale and drawn. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I stepped aside, my heart racing. "What's going on?" He sank onto my couch, his head in his hands. "She knows," he said simply. My stomach dropped. "Knows what?" "About us," he replied. "She found a note I wrote but never meant to send." I tried to explain, but there's no explaining this, is there? I sat beside him, struggling to find the right words. "What does she want to do?" "She's leaving," Paul said, his voice breaking. "She said she needs time to think, to decide if there's anything left to salvage." A wave of guilt and relief washed over me, battling for dominance. "Paul, He cut me off with a shake of his head. "Don't apologize. I don't regret what we had, Evan. Not for a second. But I can't keep hurting the people I care about. I need to figure out who I am and what I want, and I can't do that if I'm caught between two worlds." I nodded, tears welling in my eyes. "I understand." For the last time, Paul reached out and took my hand. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything." And just like that, he was gone. In the days that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Our story had been brief but transformative, leaving a mark on me that I knew would never fade. Paul had been right. What we shared was real, and it had given both of us something we desperately needed. But some connections aren't meant to last. Sometimes, they're just a moment in time, a reminder of what it means to truly feel alive. As I watched the seasons change, I found myself grateful for what Paul had given me. And though our paths had diverged, I knew that a part of him would always remain with me, just as I would remain with him. It wasn't the ending I'd hoped for, but it was the one we needed. And perhaps, in its own way, that was enough.